the next session is by Steve Melnyk from Michigan State University. Please join me in welcoming this author. He will be presenting how to build relevance into the operations management course using digital tools for student success.
Okay, thank you very much. So to everyone, welcome to this session and good afternoon. And I feel a bit like Monty Python in the sense that we're now going to have something completely different. In contrast to many of the sessions that talked about the direct usage of tools, which was very evident in the previous session, we're going to talk about the issue of how to use the digital tools, the data out there, to make the course relevant and why that's so critical now. In fact, it is becoming critical because students demand it. Next slide.
Okay, sorry about that.
Basically, if you would like to get hold of me, there's the contact information. I'll be willing to share with you any of the videos I have, any of the articles I have, because I've been building a fairly large database of articles and videos, which I've been using with the students in order to ensure that they understand what's really relevant. Now, with me is Morgan Swink, who is the lead author on our book, and a lot of these experiences are going to be directly pertaining to the Swink et al. Book, managing operations across the supply chain, but yet they're going to be relevant to almost any operations management textbook. Next slide. In order to make the sense of this, we're going to have to understand some issues. And so what I've done when I presented this idea for a topic is I broke this into 4 areas we have to identify or discuss. Number 1, the demand for relevancy. Why now and what do we do? And we're going to see that this is really a very different issue. Increasingly, we're going to point out that the changes that are taking place in our students are forcing us to ensure that they see the material as relevant. The second issue is we're going to look at is the forces driving this. To a certain extent, one of the challenges you have with the textbook is textbooks, even when they're done electronically or even when they're edited electronically, there is a lag. And what happened and is happening nowadays is there's new developments taking place that the students will have seen in their internships, but which will not be reflected extensively in the textbook. And these are the things you have to be aware of. So we're going to point out that the changes that are taking place right now are significant, they're sustainable, and they have to be addressed. The third area we're going to look at is the challenges of teaching in a pandemic. And a lot of the stuff has talked about this. This has changed the way we do it. It certainly changed it for me because I'm used to the traditional, the instructor gets in front of the class and talks. And then finally, we're going to look at the question of how do you build in relevancy? And we're going to show you that it's not as much of the tools like the Reddit, etc., but it's your ability to use the digital tools and the existing digital tools in environments like D2L to engage your students, to have them understand what's going on, and to show them that what you're teaching is not theory, but practice. Next slide. Okay, why the demand for relevance now? And I'm going to point out, okay, that we picked those up, and so I'm going to ask if we can skip that over. Sorry about that. Okay, let's talk about the changes in students. Next slide. What about our students? Let me give you the background from Michigan State University. At Michigan State University, I typically teach either the graduate level 826 course, which is manufacturing planning and control, which is where this topic is, many of these topics are taught, or I teach the undergraduate manufacturing planning and control. Now let's look at the student who I get. Typical student now has had 1 to 2 internships. Even over the pandemic, we have found a lot of the students taking the course have had virtual internships. They have worked from home while doing projects. In fact, I have one student who's working with FCA, which is Chrysler, and she is a student buyer while taking courses. What does that mean? Well, first of all, they are demanding. What they're looking at is they now see what's going on. So a comment I've heard from my students is, in the initial introduction to supply chain management, operations management, they saw things and it was very theoretical. It was very broad-based. They went out to their internships, and what they start to see is, I see what's going on. And they bring that experience back in. They're experienced in that sense that they've seen many of these things, they understand the basics. They have developed an interesting perspective. And one student put it to me best when he said, theory-based teaching sucks. That is, giving the theory without giving context or giving examples in real life is not going to sell the student. And in fact, if you're a professor or a teacher, instructor who does this, it will harm your ratings. One more thing you have to understand, these students are very goal driven. I'll give you an example. I had one student who is currently taking a class, and she informed me that when she had her internship this year with Steelcase, she asked that she be given every job which would maximize her chances of being offered a position later on. And she took that same attitude into the class. They also have a short attention span. When we present things on, my apologies, when we present things to students, we have to understand that the hour and 20-minute format that we use in lectures isn't going to do it. They want things chopped up, short, to the point, succinct, really just very applicable. And finally, they want to see concepts talked about actually work. So that's your challenge. Go on. Next slide. Let's add on top of this the fact that the business environment in which operations management and the supply chain is operating has changed significantly. Next slide. So if you look at this, I'm going to start off with a little observation. For many of us, we've been thinking about what's going on in terms of the pandemic. And we've all seen examples of shortages due to the supply chain. We've seen problems with toilet paper, yeast, everything that's coming on. And for many people, this has defined how people see things. But the funny thing is, a lot of the changes that the students are really interested in took place or were becoming present even before the pandemic. I'll give you an example. On January 30th of this year, I did a presentation to our Supply Chain Council, which consists of executives from companies that recruit from state. And in it, I was asked to talk about developments. Where's the field going? And a lot of the things I talked about, they recognized then. We are seeing changes in technology, which is advancing rapidly. Students are aware of big data. Most students nowadays are required to take courses in Python or some system of extracting data from big data. They're getting introduced to analytics, IoT, Internet of Things, cybersecurity, if not in the broad sense, from the perspective of blockchain. But more importantly, and this is an area that I was glad that this set of presentations had, which is increasingly operations and supply chain are becoming strategic. And what do I mean by strategic? It is being seen as something which affects how the company competes, and so we see a bisynchronous relationship between strategy, operations management, and supply chain, with information flows going both ways. Part of this strategy is we're starting to see several new developments which you have to be prepared to talk about because they are currently very important. First example is transparency. We're starting to see companies increasingly talk about the need for transparency. I did a project for the Department of Defense, and one of the primes, major suppliers that works in this, their major concern is they can't see beyond the first tier. So for risk management, for tracking, they need transparency. Consumers need transparency. The vice president of Starbucks put it best when he said, today's consumer wants to know the provenance of the products they consume. Sustainability is becoming important. This is one thing I've been very proud with the book. We have emphasized sustainability for the last 3 editions. The other thing is responsiveness has come to the fore. And what do we mean by responsiveness? We're starting to see a situation where cost is viewed as, for lack of a better word, an order qualifier. And what's really replacing cost is responsiveness, the ability to respond quickly to new developments. In fact, over the current pandemic, a lot of the stuff we saw was pointed to the inability of the operations management systems, either here or internationally, for example, in Australia, to respond quickly enough to the changes. An interesting phenomena that really gets students excited is that the supply chain operations management are starting to become seen as agents of digital change. That is to say, in order for us to get the benefits of digitalization, we have to spread it through the OM system, and we also have to spread it through the first tier, second tier, third tier, fourth tier, and even deal with issues such as what do we do with small firms? And those are becoming important. And finally, the increasing importance of innovation. And that's one thing that the students are starting to see, that in today's environment, it's not the ability to reduce costs that's critical, but our ability to meaningfully innovate. The Pixel 5, which was just introduced a couple of days ago, people commented that it was an example of pandemic appropriate innovation, where instead of trying to produce a phone which sold over $1,000, they produced a phone that sold for about $700, appropriate to today's environment. So those are the changes we see happening. Next one. On top of that, to give you an idea how current this is, as I was preparing for this presentation, I drew on one of the sites that I often go to, The Economist. Now, as for any instructor, there are a series of sites that you should be aware of, besides the Wall Street Journal, Business Week, Fortune, Forbes, the Financial Times. One that I often go to is The Economist. And this is taken directly from their webpage. And if you look at those topics, those are topics that students have been exposed to, students will ask you about, and you have to be prepared. And it's also something you have to be prepared to challenge students with. Because what you want them to do is to understand how what's currently happening and what you're teaching in your class relates to what's happening in the field. So as you can see here, it's talking about global shipping. It's talking about the fact that with the pandemic, there's a question about the viability of movie theaters. So this gets us a chance to talk about value propositions and how do you redesign the movie theater when people have now recognized that you can get a lot of the movies that you previously had at the theater at home. In fact, what was interesting, it was all broken by the Trolls World Tour, Universal, which found out that when they released it online, they generated $100 million of online sales. And Universal subsequently announced that in the future, all introductions will no longer go through the theater. They'll go jointly through theater and through systems like iTunes. Anyway, next one. So how about changes in the teaching environment? This is one that most of us are really familiar with. And what it means is, because of announcements in most universities that we're going to be teaching online, we have to understand that certain things have changed and that there are certain requirements which the online system is good at fulfilling, but also simultaneously poor at fulfilling. And those things affect your ability to teach relevancy and your ability to engage the student. So let's look at some of these developments. Next. Most of us have moved to either one of the three modes: asynchronous, which is essentially teaching online versus teaching at the time that you would have taught in class, asynchronous. I'm in a position, rather interestingly, that I was told 2 weeks before the class started that we were going to go online. And because a number of the students that come to Michigan State are located in places like China, Taiwan, Japan, or Italy, I had to basically choose to go with asynchronous because it's kind of impossible to do synchronous. Or we have hybrid, which is what I wound up doing. This presents challenges. Number one, lack of interactions. Students want to interact with professors, especially students who have had internships. They have questions. They want to raise those questions. They want to discuss the issues they've seen. They want to challenge, they want to ask questions about things they've seen in class. And this is where I pick up the second point. Tangents go missing. When I was just thinking about how I structure a class, for an 80-minute class, I have enough material to cover, in general, 65 minutes, if no one asks a question. And I can draw it out by appropriate examples. But typically what I find is that some student will ask a question, and the question will get me on a tangent, which further shows the relevancy of what we're doing. So, for example, a student who's worked in the DoD, who's worked with a defense contractor, will ask you about, well, what's going on with 889 and why should I worry? And you can talk about that. And those are tangents, and they're critical to the learning experience. And I apologize for the typo. I do misspell occasionally, and spell checkers do not pick up that typo. But there's also the lack of ability of students and the faculty to share experiences. So how do we overcome these issues? Well, in order to do that, we've done a few things differently. And let me get into them. Next one. Okay, I'm going to talk about, the first thing you want to talk about is, how do you build relevancy? Number one, read the news, or force your students to read the news. And I'm going to recommend at least 5 or 6 sites, 4 of which are here. Business Week, Fortune. The Economist has a magnificent site. It's one of the most interesting sites you can get about business. Washington Post. In fact, Washington Post, if the students are members of Prime, they can get the Washington Post for $1 a month. And that Washington Post, I have found, has had such great articles that have directly touched on operations management and supply chain. The other 2 that I don't have here are the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times. You know, essentially, either you or your students read these, because what they're going to see are developments, questions, issues that they can bring to class. The next thing is, once you've identified these issues, bring them to class. And if you're dealing it, I don't care if it's synchronous or asynchronous, you can do it in several different ways. You can do them as bonus assignments. You can do them as part of discussion boards. And in fact, I'm going to make a suggestion. One of the most powerful tools I've found in bringing relevance to operations management has been the discussion board feature of that's offered in most teaching environments. I'll ask a question of you. How many of out there have used the discussion boards in your classes where you're teaching? Anyone? This is my attempt to create interaction. Okay, we have one person. How successful was it, Lucinda? Okay, so we have Peggy Lee saying it. How successful are they? Okay, how do you make a discussion board successful? Most of the time we use discussion boards, and what we do is we ask the students to comment. I'm going to make a suggestion. You want to use a discussion board that's very interesting? Number one, when you ask a student, when you grade their discussions, here are some guidelines we've learned based on our experiences. Number one, make sure the grading is timely. That is, within no more than 3 days after the discussion board closes, the grades have got to be done in feedback. Number two, when you ask students to participate, most of the time they don't understand what they're being asked to participate on. We have a very simple guideline. They have to do at least 3 things. Number one, create a thread. Number two, read and respond to at least 2 other threads. And number 3, try to internalize or give examples of the concepts that they've seen in class in terms of their own work. So, for example, so far in the class we're teaching in 372, I've had discussion boards about business models. And students have been very good on introducing what they've seen at their companies or how they've seen poor examples of business models being introduced. And it's amazing. Some of the students will have read 15 to 20 different threads. And by the way, one of the things that's really nice about D2L is D2L does a magnificent job of giving you an idea of who is doing what, how many threads have they read, how many threads have they posted to, so you can almost keep an online, okay, yes. And they do post videos, you're right. Somebody brought up the point. Students are really good at posting videos. In fact, one of the videos we're going to show you is a video that was introduced to me by a student last year or last term before in January for my 826 class. So again, use the power of discussion boards. Discussion boards become your mechanism for having students share ideas. And so let's go on. Use videos that are different. I'm going to mix. Okay, a good question. Okay, so we have issues. So as pointed out, different teaching environments have different capabilities, but in general, they agree on the same set of issues. Let me also offer you some other issues. Number one, I am not a fan of the videos that are produced by most book companies. Not naming names, and it's not unique to McGraw-Hill, but they tend to be very traditional. For example, how do you teach someone about continuous flow? Most of the time, what do we use? We use a video of a petroleum company or a chemical company, right? What's another great example? One of the things I found is use YouTube. And use YouTube with either 4K video downloader, which is free, or Movie Sherlock. And what they do is they enable you to capture the video so you can load it into other PowerPoint slides. So one example is I just got through teaching a section on manufacturing plant processes. Now, if you look at the traditional ones, the ways we've done it, it's kind of effective but dull. You want the students to remember. So what I did is I used 4 different videos. To show a job shop, I used the Cedar Mountain Banjo Company. Now, just a little bit truth in advertising. I am a banjo player. I play open back banjo. I am also a member of the world's largest fraternity, banjo players whose wives hate the banjo. I was once practicing the banjo and my wife said to me, "Could you practice it somewhere else?" And I said, "Where?" And she said, "Elk Rapids, which is 200 miles away. It's our vacation home." I got the picture, didn't like it. Anyway, in it, you see a prime example of a job shop. And then what you do is you look and pair that with the Deering Good Time banjo. The Good Time banjo is an assembly line banjo. It's made for beginning students. And then you use that to ask the following question. Why does Cedar Mountain job shop make sense versus Good Time assembly line? And what makes them different? What makes them the same? That gets students thinking, because what's key here is this the same product. And what you can now show them is that it's not the product that's critical. It's also the way it's built. And suddenly this concept of capacity as capability becomes visible to the students. By the way, I used to teach a continuous flow. I used a Food Network video on Dum Dum candies. And what's interesting about it, it shows you why they're continuous. It shows you the difference between making 500 banjos a day through Good Time and Deering versus making 60,000 Good Time lollipops an hour. It also does something else which is interesting. It also explains the mystery flavor, and most students find that memorable. And by the way, what's the mystery flavor? The mystery flavor is where 2 rolls of candy, let's say cherry and lime, come together. So it's a setup. And instead of throwing it away, the company has decided to package it as the mystery flavor. And what happens is students wind up remembering that. And they also understand the lessons that you're trying to get them to understand. For example, I teach setup production using an F1 racing video, which is highly memorable because they can see the fact that it shows the difference between a 1950s F1 race in Indianapolis, where the changeover time, pit stop time, is 67 seconds, versus 2013 in Melbourne, an F1 race, where the setup time is under 3 seconds, and they see it. So again, understand, think about using different videos. Videos are critical. Use videos because they attract the students. Also, consider using virtual coffee shops. One of the things I thought about was when you have students who in the past have been used to and they have been looking forward to, no, that's an interesting one somebody posted. I'll have to get more information about that one. Anyway, if you look at some of the things that have happened, students are interested in getting to know the faculty. In fact, when they get to the high-level supply chain courses, one of the things they're looking for is faculty interactions. One of the things I found out that most universities have available is this concept called Microsoft Bookings. And what Microsoft Bookings enables you to do is you can literally set up virtual coffee shops where you can arrange to meet with students. They book a time, you have the time set up, and then you can use the appointments that are automatically generated to access Microsoft Teams. And guess what? You have a chance to talk to the students. You have a chance to find out what their hobbies, their experiences, and suddenly that relationship. And they'll tell you what are the things they're looking for in the class. And again, that's a way of enforcing the notion of relevancy. Finally, use voluntary Zoom sessions to allow for question and answer. As I said, I started off initially doing entirely asynchronous, and now I'm using a hybrid. But to show you the power of using a different video, what I'm going to show you is a video I use to show projects. And instead of looking at boats or whatever, jet airplanes, the traditional ones, this is the video I decided to use, which is in the next one. So let's flip over to that. And let's start that one. Can you hear it?
Harper, you may need to unmute since you're running it.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Sorry about that.
Essentially, what have we learned? In today's environment, your effectiveness as an instructor is not something going to be a function of the content. It's going to be a function of your ability to bring relevancy to the class. And this relevancy issue has been made more and more important. I found myself teaching very differently now than I did 5 years ago. I find myself more forced to come into class. And in fact, when I used to teach face-to-face, I would always start off with spending the first 5 minutes about new developments. You have to do that. Your students expect you because it prepares them for their jobs. And therefore you have to start thinking about how do we use the digital tools, Google, the various YouTube, etc., to get students to see developments and to apply it to what they do, so that they see the material not as just simply theoretical, but as something that can be used and is used in practice by managers to solve real problems in real time. And when you do that, and when you engage your students, you find that the experience is often very good. And that's what I've been finding so far. Even with having to go with online exams, the students are enjoying the fact that in many cases, they can review material, they see the material is relevant. And I've had more than one student remark that when he looks at the material, he can say to himself, I've seen that in my work. And that to me is the acid test. So at this stage, I decided to make this half an hour. So I'm going to open it up for questions or comments. Anyone has any comments, please, or ideas, please share it. Because as I said, I didn't want to focus on the tools as much as the content. Because I think, to me, the tools are sauce. The meat, the base is the content. And that has to be relevant. Because if you make that relevant, everything else works. Comments? Questions?
So Steve, there were quite a few comments about different other videos that they've used in class.
Yep.
The F1 pit stop,
Yep.
with Bear in the Woods.
That's one I'm interested in seeing.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
One of the things I think would be really nice, and I've recommended this before in McGraw-Hill, is if you had a repository of these videos, because it'd be nice for students, for faculty who use the textbooks that are offered by McGraw-Hill, to be able to look online and to see what videos are available for process choice, what videos are available for inventory. Because some of the videos that are out there are utterly great. And it'd be nice for us to be able to know about them instead of searching for them.
Okay. No.
Hey, Steve, this is Morgan. I'll just throw in two really great comments, and also your suggestion about news sources was great. Wall Street Journal, and I'm sure you're aware of this, but they have several news feeds, one for logistics, one for AI, plus just their general 10-point, and then there's other organizations out there that will also provide news feeds on different supply chain topics, some more procurement oriented, some more manufacturing. And I find those to be really helpful because every morning I've got that list of things, to try to peruse and then pick something to talk about in class. But my question for you, Steve, is how do you balance? I mean, I love doing that too, but inevitably I'll bring up a topic in class and everybody wants to discuss it, and before I know it, the time is slipping away. So how do you balance, the need and the benefit for bringing in these relevant current topics against also trying to preserve time to get covered what you need to cover in the class? How do you balance that?
Basically, I invoke the mother rule, which is I tell people in advance that I can cut off the interactions, and I do, because what I do is I look very carefully at what the time is. And if I start to see that we're starting to spend too much time, I say, let me look at that and discuss it later on. Or else I ask the students to, we make it a discussion board question. But the point is, you as the instructor have the right to stop things going. Because what's going to happen is you are really on a tight schedule. The reality is, and everyone knows this, is that the amount of material we are expected to teach within a 16 or 15-week session is increasing amazingly. So you have to, in essence, start, and as soon as you go beyond, and basically what I do is I look at the time, and if we're spending more than 5 minutes on a topic, that's it, it's done. And I simply say, sorry, got to cut it off because we have to move forward. And students understand that because I warn them about that. Right from the get-go in my first class. So they understand that the instructor has the right. And the reason I call it the mummy rule is because there's a T-shirt that I loved and I got from my wife, which shouldn't have done it, and says, because I'm the mother, because that's why. So it's essentially you're responsible for the class. Number two, and this is going back to something Morgan, I want to thank Morgan for bringing up the issue of these feeds. There are sites like Supply Chain Brain, etc., which are amazing because they have they have a lot of information. In addition to that, look at using sources like McKinsey, Gartner. What makes McKinsey and Gartner so really good is that what they do is they'll let you download articles that you can then share with your students. Another source that you might want to think about is Supply Chain Management Review. When you talked about Trevor Talk, the managing editor of Supply Chain Management Review, they have a fairly liberal policy. You can download articles and share it with your students. And often those articles are really timely. And in many cases, they're written by us. So they're good too. But anyway, but you have these abilities. So what we're trying to say is that you are not limited to the textbook. And there's all these opportunities. And the only problem you have is managing them. And I think the idea that Morgan had is one I use, which is every morning I get up and then I look through the feeds and I pick up a couple of issues which are interesting and I post them to myself. I put them into a file, so to speak, a virtual file. And that way I can see what's going on and I can figure out what it is and what topics I can bring by field, by topic area, but what videos, etc., I can bring by topic area. So thank you, Morgan. Other questions?
Steve, have you had a lot of students ask you sort of more COVID-related questions with regard to supply chain?
The interesting thing is not now, but yes, I did earlier. Michigan State, like everyone else, closed down online in-person teaching March 11th, I think it was, or March 13th. And when we closed them down, a lot of students in my graduate level classes really wanted to have questions about the COVID-19, and they had questions about what's going on with shortages of supply, etc. And the nice thing about that, those very same questions were ones that we were being asked by things like, Bloomberg Business. And so what I would do is I would feed them information that Bloomberg Business and other sites were giving so they could see what's going on. And that helped them understand some of the comments made. And what I also did is I would write short posts in D2L, which would describe, for example, why we're starting to see problems and how we can use operations management principles to deal with the pandemic. So I talked then about, SKU simplification, SKU pruning, process improvement, core competencies, what's a critical process. And those type of things I found very, very effective.
Have you always taught online before?
No, I started teaching online with BISC. And BISC is a hybrid. Michigan State University offers a Master's of Science in Supply Chain Management. And so what we do is we have a hybrid program, which is you are pre-recording certain lectures, and then you have a 1-hour lecture every week. And one of the things that really taught me is some of the discipline that you have to get into when you're doing online teaching. For example, BISC got me to understand the rule of 20. No video, no teaching segment ever lasts more than 20 minutes. And the time I did this last, when we revised our overheads and our content for the latest round of BISC, we reduced that from 20 minutes to 15 minutes. And what they got you to understand is there is a discipline. You teach differently online than you teach in person. And then when you teach differently, you have to understand that students don't have the ability to basically wade through an entire lecture. So you tend to look at your lectures not as lectures, but as bundles of very focused sections. And those are things I'm now bringing into the class. So, for example, I'm getting into teaching a section on quality. There's going to be a section of what we mean by quality. Then there'll be a section on the kind of precedence of quality. Then there'll be a section on what quality is statistically. And then each one of the major tools will have its own lecture format, so that students, when they study, can go back to it and they can review it. And they can ask questions, because what it is very, very focused. So the answer to your question is, yeah. And thank goodness I did have BISC, because it really influenced my ability to transition fairly seamlessly. One more thing I should recommend people start thinking about doing is, if you teach online, especially asynchronous, think about posting at the beginning of every week what we're going to do this week. Students love the structure. Students love to know what they're going to be doing so they can focus on it. Also, if you're doing D2L, use the calendar feature. The calendar feature is amazing because it makes sure the students know when assignments are due, so you don't have to tell them. So anyway, those are some of the things I've learned from BISC. And yes, I've been doing it. I've been doing it since, my gosh, I think 2014.
Fantastic. Noelle, did you have anything else? I noticed you put something in the chat.
Yeah, I just added a really quick comment, and this came up in our panel session earlier this morning, and I think that one of our sessions later might touch on it a little bit. But we at McGraw-Hill, we also help to curate a site called ominthenews.com. So OM as in operations management. And that pulls in different news articles from similar sources that Steve has mentioned, but also really unique sources from all across the country, and is specifically made for you to use with your students in your class. So there are curated discussion questions, links to topics in all of our McGraw-Hill textbooks, including the Swink, Melnyk, Hartley text. So if you're looking for specific topics and things, it's searchable. There's video content on there as well. So I know, Steve, you and I have talked before, and I definitely want to continue the conversation about curating video stuff, because I'm right there with you. And OM in the News does a little bit of that, but I think there's so much more that we can do to help put instructors in touch with content that other instructors are using, because I think this is so valuable. So thank you for sharing this. It was great.
One more thing you want to think about is not only have information from the United States and Canada, but try seeing about global. Increasingly, our students are global.
Definitely.
And when they're global, they want to see examples from Australia. When I had a joint appointment with the University of Newcastle in Australia, I found that when I used American examples, things that every student here would, every student in the United States would understand, they're lost in Australia. So you think about having international examples, because in some cases, for example, I've seen what's happening at Haier in Qingdao, China. And what they're doing is they are introducing one of the most interesting examples of an ecosystem I've ever seen in the supply chain. One of the goals that they have, which I think is fascinating, is they have now taken as a goal by 2021, they're going to produce a customized piece of appliance in the same time as cost as a standard piece. So think about that. So anyway, any other questions before we wrap it up? Because I think we're almost to the time.
We are at time, and that was really a great session and so valuable. Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you for joining Morgan as well.